Hello, this is Steve Bond, and this is a rather unusual video post because normally I have videos of, some things I've done in lectures and talking, and this time I have to just come to you straight off the cuff and talk because I have a new book out just this week, and I really needed to tell you about it. My new book is called Confessions of an Introvert, and it's available on Amazon in Kindle format right now, just after Thanksgiving. And theoretically, the paperback will be available on December 15th. And I have to say, I have found this a rather strange story in trying to understand how this book came to be. This is my first book in the last 6 years. And as a writer, that's been a fairly long time. But life intervened. And then about 2.5 years ago, I was ready to get back to writing and was looking forward to finishing a novel that I had started, which is still coming along. That'll happen later. But the way the unconscious works, I began to have a series of dreams that were very clear and very insistent that this was the book that I needed to work on. I don't know why. I can say that the book ended up dealing with my near death experience when I was 15 years old. And I suppose that I should have realized that I couldn't really go my whole life and not write about my near death experience. The information is in the book. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but a near death experience is a profound experience of what I want to call a different level of consciousness. And I had not previously done the research or the thinking to understand my own near death experience. So I ended up putting it in this book, Confessions of an Introvert. The beginnings of the book had to do kind of interestingly with a patient of mine had been reading Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, that 1973 book that actually won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction back then. I don't know if you know the story, but Ernest Becker was not a Freudian analyst. He was an academic writing, and he was dying at the time that he wrote Denial of Death and did not live to see uh, his Pulitzer, which came after his death posthumously. Kind of an interesting story. But at any rate, my client was reading this and asked me what I thought of this book, Denial of Death, which I had read in graduate school a long time ago, 35 years ago. And I hadn't really read it since then, so I read it again. And I mean, in case you don't know, I mean, Denial of Death is in one way sort of an exposition of the psychoanalytic enterprise, how it works, what it does, with Becker's unique perspective, which has been called in later years existential Freudianism, existential psychoanalysis. Uh, there's a lot I could talk about with that book, but it won the Pulitzer. And when I read it again, I realized, and this is what I told my client, that you could not write such a book nowadays. The book is too technical at a level the general reader's going to have a problem with. To me, in a way, it's a beautiful book, but not a book that you could write today. Uh, and it's a Freudian book. That set off the idea in me that if you were going to write a book that described psychoanalysis today in the way that Becker did it in 1973, how would you write the book today? And that simple inspiration or idea sort of was a seed in the unconscious. And I began to think about it. And I realized that for me, it would be a book about individuation. And how could I talk about individuation in a way that made any sense? Uh, a second aspect had to do with from time to time people have asked me when I was going to write Living Myth 2, my book from 1993, been a long time now. And I had thought I would never write another analysis book. I thought I was kind of done. I'm more interested in my fiction, so I really didn't have any ideas about Living Myth 2. And then this idea about how to write denial of death in a modern way that people would read came in, and there I was. I mean, I was kind of stuck with it, trying to write about maturity and the maturation process, which is somewhat the Freudian term for the Jungian individuation. And they're not quite the same thing. The Freudians have to do maturation of the ego. Individuation is something quite unique. And I thought about cases that I might sort of use because to really describe or understand individuation, you would have to have a case that was 25 years long or 30 years long, something like that, to see the growth of the personality over a long period of time. And I began to feel that I wasn't comfortable writing up some of the cases that I have that in fact are that long. The only case that would make any sense and be at the depth that it needed to be would be my own case, as in the book turned into an autobiography. And I thought, oh God, that is the last thing I want to write. Because why would my life be something that someone would be interested in reading? But the challenge came to me from the unconscious, and so I set out to write a story with only the inner events, a story with really very little about outer events in life and outer things, but the inner events of a life, something like Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's autobiography. So I'm hoping that maybe this interests you in the book. There is the part about the NDE, but I do have to say, for me, the challenge was to write about maturity and what that really means. That's partly in chapter 7, the opus chapter, because the more I got into it, the more I realized how difficult it is to describe individuation, and particularly the opus, the work, which is an important and unique aspect of individuation. And it's kind of a Jungian thing, although I realized that for everybody, at a certain age, the idea of legacy becomes kind of a psychological compulsion, as I experienced in my own grandparents, which I write about. And then I decided that it wasn't really fair to go the whole way through thinking about the near death experience without coming to some kind of conclusion about a Jungian approach to a near death experience. And I decided I had the material to do that. So I'm thinking the book is interesting. I hope you'll read it and maybe let me know what you think. Thanks.